Well, I don't think that I have to do much to convince you that the world can be a disturbing place. We look at the past year, it's been rough. 2017 has been rough. We've had multiple natural disasters. We've had acts of terror and mass shootings. We've had racial tension and violence. We've had divisive politics. We've had threats of war, threats of nuclear war, no less. It's been a rough year. We've had all these things bombarded at us in the news and in all forms of media. And so as we look at this past year, it would be tempting to say, yes, this is a disturbing world that we live in. And yet it's not as though it wasn't at one point. When we look at history, we can see that when you study history, you can be both inspired and depressed at the same time. You can be inspired by great stories of wonderful people who just did wonderful things in the midst of adversity. And then you can also be depressed at the number of things that people do to one another and the cruelty with which people can treat one another. But that's been that way throughout history. But nonetheless, statistically speaking, it's interesting to hear that the world is safer and less violent than it has ever been, as long as people have been keeping track. It is safer and less violent than the world has ever been. That's hard to wrap our minds around because we're bombarded with all of the bad news and the things that are going on. And one thing is that in the United States, it does seem as though we're dealing with some things that we haven't had to deal with in known history in our part of the world, as far as terrorism and things of that nature and mass shootings. But yes, the world is a safer place than it has been, and mass shootings are quite rare. But we wouldn't think so. And it seems so close to home when it happens in the United States. And it leads us to live our lives in fear. Right? I mean, all of these things lead us to live our lives with a philosophy of fear and almost paranoia towards other people. I mean, think about it. In this sermon series, we're going to be looking at lots of these different kinds of events and how we as Christians can respond with faith, hope, and love in the midst of a very violent world. And yet, when we look at the first two things we're looking at today, acts of terrorism and mass shootings, when we look at these things and how we respond to them, first of all, what is the difference between a mass shooting and an act of terrorism? Splitting hairs? Maybe. But generally speaking, when we think of an act of terrorism, we think of something that's done by somebody who has an affiliation with, or at least is giving credit to, a terrorist organization. Oftentimes it's done with a lot of planning, whereas a mass shooting could be planned or it could not really be that well planned out. It's usually not associated with a terrorist group. Oftentimes it can be somebody that other people know, whether it is somebody that they work with or whatever, what have you. But they both cause terror, right? And one of the reasons why it causes terror is because of the unpredictability of it. We don't know when it will happen or where it will happen, and generally speaking, when it does, it happens in a situation where people are mostly helpless. There's nothing that you can do, and it's very hard to prevent. And so it leads us to live our lives in fear. I mean, how many of you were afraid to go to a movie theater after the shooting at a Batman movie? You know, how many of you were a little bit queasy going to church the next Sunday after the shooting in that Baptist church? You know, how many of you are afraid to go to a shopping mall or a sporting event or a concert? You know, any time now that we go to public events where there are a large group of people, how many of you now kind of look at where the exits are? You know, I mean, that's a good thing to do anyway, but how many of you do that thinking, okay, how's my best way to get out of here if something happens? You know, these are things that we don't want to think about, but unfortunately, we have to. And then we tend to look at people differently too, don't we? If you're in the business of security, you have to. And we go to more places where you have to be checked and make sure that you're okay and that you're not carrying anything. And so we look at people with suspicion, especially if they're different than us. We look at people with suspicion, wondering if they might be up to something. And so we live our lives in fear, and yet is this the right way to live? Is this the way in which we should be treating or viewing other people? We tend to want to stereotype and to say, well, all of the people in this group are bad, you know, and we need to get rid of them, or we need to keep them from being here. You know, we want to simplify the world, which is natural. Our minds, we want to simplify things, and we want to say, okay, this group good, this group bad. But the world is oftentimes not as simple as that. You see, when we react in fear, the result is usually not good. When we react in fear, we tend to adopt some pretty unchristian attitudes and sometimes engage in some unchristian actions towards other people. 2 months after well, let's think about this yesterday. What happened yesterday? Hawaii was on alert because they had this notice that there was a ballistic missile headed their way. And for a little over a half hour, a lot of people thought that they were going to die because it said this is not a test. And in our current world context, that would be taken very seriously. Maybe 10 years ago, maybe they would have been a little bit more skeptical, I don't know. But now, in our current tense world, that would be taken very seriously. I don't know how in the world that happened, but I feel sorry for the people there for that time when they thought that they were possibly going to die. It reminds us of when the bombing that happened at Pearl Harbor. And 2 months after the bombing of Pearl Harbor, there was an executive order passed by Roosevelt that about 120,000 Japanese Americans were rounded up from the West Coast and placed in one of 10 internment camps across the nation. Many of them were American citizens. And there was a lot of controversy about that when it happened. You know, some people said that, well, it was to protect us because what if they defected? You know, what if they decided that they were going to fight against us? And then other people said, well, it's to protect them because what if a lot of Americans are afraid of them and so they hurt them, and so it's to protect them. But then in the Reagan-Bush era of Congress passed basically a law that said, basically it was an apology saying that this was a grievous error at a time when we reacted in fear. And they gave $20,000 to each person who was placed in an internment camp. And interestingly enough, one of the people who was placed in an internment camp said that he reacted to the idea that they were placed there for their protection. And he said, well, if we were there for our protection, why were the guns pointed inward instead of outward? We've seen throughout history that humanity has done a lot worse than that when we've reacted in fear. Oftentimes today, our fear, when we react in fear, it's that we tend to stereotype and believe that all people of the Muslim faith are bad. And we have a lot of reason to do that, you know? Pretty much all, or almost all, of the acts of terrorism are done by Muslim extremists. And we can say they look at their own scriptures in the Quran, and there are scriptures in there that talk about killing those that are not of their faith. And they look at those scriptures and they justify their behavior, they justify what they're doing, and we can say that Islam is a religion of violence. Or is it that simple? I remember when I was in Wilton in southeast Iowa, I went to Davenport and visited a mosque. I was doing some research for a sermon series on other religions, and I visited a prayer service at the mosque. And after the prayer service, by the way, it was on a weekday, and it was during the noon hour, and the place was packed. Not, people of all ages. But after the service, I visited with the leader there, and he talked about how he is trying to fight the stereotype that the Muslim faith is one of violence. And he's trying to promote it, that it can be a religion of peace as well. And so he's fighting this stereotype while dealing with car damage and threats and windows being broken out of the mosque. There was a window that was needing repair when I was there. There were children's activities going on when that window was broken out, but luckily nobody was hurt. Now, you can say, well, but the scriptures, you can read their scriptures, and it says you kill people who are not of their faith. And that's true, but you can do the same thing with the Bible. There's plenty of material in the Bible if you want to justify whatever you want to justify. There are plenty of scriptures where God orders people to kill every man, woman, and child. Why? Because that people group is bad. because they're sinful, because they are so sinful that it justifies killing every man, woman, and child in that entire city. That would be disturbing to us today. We think King Herod is bad. King Herod, we think he's bad because he ordered all children ages 2 and under in Bethlehem to be killed, to make sure that Jesus would be killed. And yet, depending on how you read Exodus, isn't that what God did? Didn't God have every firstborn child of the Egyptians killed so that the Hebrew people could go free from slavery? Isn't that the same thing? And that leads us to ask the question, how low are we willing to go to accomplish what we consider to be a good thing? Does the end always justify the means? You might say, well, Mike, that's the Old Testament. We read that differently. We interpret that differently. Okay. Well, some Christians do, some Christians don't. And it's the same thing with the Muslim faith. Some Muslims interpret their scriptures in one way, and they interpret that literally, and they justify all kinds of acts of terror. And others interpret it differently, and they say, no, we are to be a religion of peace. We are to promote peace and joy. And so it depends on how you read your scriptures and what you do with them. It really does. And so as we look at this, let's look at the example of Jesus, right? Because we're students of Jesus, so we want to look at the example of Jesus' life and how it is that he, what we can follow as a pattern. And so I want to frame this whole thing, first of all, in James chapter 1, verses 19 through 20. And it says, "Know this, my dear brothers and sisters. Everyone should be quick to listen, slow to speak, and slow to become angry. This is because an angry person doesn't produce God's righteousness." So that's just for the whole series of sermons, that's kind of frames it. We don't want to respond right away in anger, but we want to respond with the example of Christ. And as we look at the life of Christ, we see that Jesus refused to stereotype people. He always was including people that made the Jews stressed. He always included people that the Jews felt were beyond hope. For instance, Jews and Samaritans did not get along because Jews believed that the Samaritans had mixed their faith with other faiths, and they believed that they were just terrible people, and so they would have nothing to do with the Samaritans. Jesus speaks with the Samaritan woman and turns her into an evangelist. And not only that, but what do we think of today when we hear the word Samaritan? The Good Samaritan, right? We think about good works. We think about saints, we think about wonderful people who are willing to give and to help others. That's not what the Jews thought, but Jesus changed that when he made up a story. He told a parable about a man who was beaten on the road and left for dead, and 2 religious leaders walk by and they do nothing to help. And then this Samaritan comes and helps the person, and Jesus says, now who is the neighbor in that story? You see how much Jesus is stepping on toes with his stories? Sometimes we don't realize that until we think about the context. This is an insulting story to the Jews. The Jews, they did nothing to this guy, but the Samaritan's the example of a wonderful person. Jesus includes the Romans, the ones who are oppressing them. In one instance, Jesus comes to a Roman soldier comes to Jesus, and his daughter is sick and dying, and he says, "You can heal my daughter, I know you can." And he says, "Jesus, you don't even have to come and see my daughter. You can just say the word and she'll be healed. Just like I give orders to my soldiers and they do what I say, you can give an order and she'll be healed." And Jesus said, "Wow, I have not seen, this man has more faith than all of Israel." Wait a minute, what? Jesus? What? Careful what you say there, because that is really insulting to Israel. Here's this Roman, he's not a Jew, right? He doesn't have their faith. And yet he's saying this man has more faith than all of Israel. You see, Jesus understood that the world is more complicated than they are good, they are bad. Jesus understood that there were some good Samaritans, there were some good Romans, and there are some bad Jews. He understood that. There's good and bad within every people group. And so he refused to stereotype. Let's look at Rome. As I said, Rome was oppressing the Israelites. They had all kinds of philosophies about how they should deal with this issue. There were a group of people called the Pharisees who believed, well, if we follow the law well enough, then God will send the Messiah and he will set things right. And so they're very legalistic about how they went about things because they wanted to bring about the new kingdom of God. Then there were the Zealots. They believed violence was the answer. If we have a violent revolution, we can overthrow the Romans and we can be independent. The Apostle Peter was a zealot. So Peter believed violence was the answer, at least at some point in his life. It's interesting that Jesus chose Peter as one of his disciples. There was a diversity within the disciples. And it also makes sense of that time when Jesus is arrested. You know, and in our scripture reading, it didn't name him, but another gospel says it's Peter, who draws his sword and he's ready to fight. You know, it's almost as though he's probably thinking, I was born for this moment. Long live Israel. You know, we're gonna fight. This is the time. This is the moment of truth. And Jesus said, put your sword away. You know, those who live by the sword will die by the sword. You could say that Jesus' ministry, much of it was a form of nonviolent protest against Rome. Even as the crucifixion, Jesus refuses, no matter what happens, Jesus refuses to lower himself and to engage in violence as a response to violence. And he allows himself to be defeated, and yet in defeat he actually is victorious. As what happens when Jesus is on the cross is he absorbs all of our hatred and all of our sinfulness, and he reflects it back at us, which is a point of shame. Right? It's reflected back at us, and look at what we have done. And yet at the same time, Jesus forgives. He reflects our sin back at us, and at the same time forgives us. And he turned a symbol, the cross, which was a symbol of hatred and fear and terror, and changed it into the greatest symbol of hope the world has ever seen. It's quite amazing, really. But Jesus included people who were different than he was. You know, he included a zealot when he seemed to be against violence. You know, he included Samaritans, he included Romans, he included anyone he could include. Tax collectors, prostitutes, anyone. He included anyone who was open. Anyone who was open to him, he would include. See, Christianity is really quite an inclusive faith, except for when we react in fear. And so, the question is, how do we react? And this opens up a whole host of questions, such as when is violence necessary? Is violence necessary? What about for self-defense? What about to protect our family? Or to protect a nation? You know, when is violence necessary? These are hard questions to answer. People have all kinds of different opinions on it. Personally, I tend to believe that we live in a very broken world with broken people. And sometimes as a result, unfortunately, we have to engage in less than perfect solutions. I don't think that anybody thinks that war is a wonderful thing, but I think that there can be times when it is unfortunately the only thing. But those decisions are very hard to make. You know, we're having to deal with that right now with North Korea. You know, we hear it in the news all the time. And we're having to wrestle with the decision of, is it okay to attack somewhere ahead of time, preemptively, for protective security, or preventative security, I guess, to prevent an attack on us. And yet, at the same time, we're weighing that with the fact that we know that if we attack first, we know that there are going to be many people in North Korea who will get caught up in a bloody war that they have nothing to do with. You know, they're virtually innocent. And so, these are very, very difficult decisions. I'm glad I don't have to make them. And that's why I hope that wherever you are politically, whether you love our president or hate our president, whether you like our elected officials or not, I hope you pray for them. Because regardless of where you are, whether you lean right or left politically, they need your prayers, and they need wisdom, and they need the guidance, all the guidance that they can get. Because they are the ones ultimately who have to make these decisions. So I hope you pray for them. Secondly, because we don't have to make those decisions, But we do have to decide every day how it is that we're going to treat other people. We do have to decide every day how we're going to treat people who are different from us, people who might have a different religion than we do, people who might sometimes look a little intimidating. And so I would encourage you to follow the example of Christ. And of course, in order to follow the example of Christ, we have to know what Jesus did. And so all of a sudden, reading the scripture is so much more important than just for your own spiritual growth. It seems as though the world itself hangs in the balance as to whether or not we know what Jesus did, so we can hopefully discern what we would do to follow his example. And so I want to encourage you, rather than living in fear, rather than living in paranoia of other people, I would encourage you to seek out the good in other people. I would encourage you to, even for strangers, even for people who are different than we are, I would encourage you to give them the benefit of the doubt until you can no longer. I would encourage you to treat others as children of God and treat them with the love of God. That's hard. If we look at Romans 12, which was read for us, it says, if possible, knowing that sometimes it might not be possible, but if possible, to the best of your ability, live at peace with all people. Don't try to get revenge for yourselves. Instead, if your enemy is hungry, feed him. If he is thirsty, give him a drink. And by doing this, you will pile burning coals of fire upon his head. And we like that part. Let's face it. Don't be defeated by evil, but defeat evil with good. Right? Whenever possible, that is to be the rule for our life. So violence, even though it may at times unfortunately be necessary, it should be the exception rather than the rule. The rule is Romans 12 right there. Overcome evil with good whenever you can, and follow the love of Christ and show it to others. It's different. It's hard. It's countercultural. But it's the way of Jesus. And I would encourage you to do so to the best of your ability. Amen.